The spark in Lewisburg. Before we dive in, if you're ready for the darkest corners of America's prison underworld, hit subscribe, drop a like, and buckle in. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. These are the men who ruled the penitentiary from the inside out. The summer heat in Pennsylvania had a way of sinking into the bones, even behind concrete walls and razor wire. On the morning of August 27, 1997, inside the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, the heat carried something else, an energy that made correctional officers restless and inmates unusually quiet. Some men paced their cells. Others sat still for hours. Everyone felt something coming, but no one quite knew what. Lewisburg had seen its share of violence over the years, but nothing could prepare the institution for what was about to unfold. Federal investigators would later describe it as a war announced in silence. No warning shot. No formal declaration, just a chain of messages and grudges spreading across the country like a slow-burning fuse. At the heart of that fuse were two groups, a white supremacist prison organization known for extreme secrecy, and a predominantly black prison group rooted in the streets of Washington, D.C. Their rivalry had stretched across institutions for decades, small clashes, mutual disrespect, and a long memory for insults. But until the late 1990s, the tensions had not grown into open conflict. That changed the moment a secret message left the federal supermax in Florence, Colorado, the kite that traveled 1,800 miles. In the underground world of federal prisons, communication doesn't move through email or phone calls. It travels through kites, tiny scraps of paper, coded or disguised, passed from one inmate to another through handshakes, laundry bags, food trays, or the seams of envelopes. A kite could cross thousands of miles without a guard ever noticing. The kite that started the Lewisburg violence began in a lockdown cell in the Rocky Mountains. Investigators later traced it with painstaking detail, first from Florence to a prison in Chino, California, and finally into the hands of a white inmate inside Lewisburg. To the naked eye, the paper looked harmless family updates, greetings, routine chatter. But between the lines, written in invisible ink, were three words: war with D.C. It was the kind of message that required no clarification. Those three words were enough to mobilize men who lived by codes older than most state laws. Once the phrase appeared inside Lewisburg, there was no turning back. Rumors before the storm. In the days leading up to the attack, subtle movement began. Inmates who usually mingled freely started sticking closer to their own groups. Conversations became shorter. Eyes stayed fixed on doorways. Guards noticed unusual requests, quiet transfers between units, shifts in recreation patterns, changes in shower times. Among the white inmates, certain individuals had started acting with purpose. They whispered instructions during meal lines. They signaled to each other through taps on metal tables or folded laundry. Lookouts formed in corners where officers rarely paid attention. Most prisoners didn't know the exact plan, but they recognized the tone. Something major was brewing. One man in particular carried himself with the confidence of someone who had already accepted the consequences. His name appeared frequently in gang intelligence reports over the years, a convicted murderer with a reputation for discipline, brutality, and unwavering loyalty to his group's leaders. Within Lewisburg, he was known as a problem solver, a man who handled missions without hesitation. He allegedly received the invisible ink message and was expected to enforce it. A target marked. Among the DC-affiliated inmates was a man named Abdul Salam. On the streets, he was a neighborhood figure connected to the DC underworld. Inside the system, he had become known as someone who held influence among his peers. No one knows precisely why he was chosen as the primary target. Some believe he had challenged members of the opposing group during an earlier dispute. Others said he was accused of disrespecting one of the white inmates weeks earlier. There were also rumors that he had been labeled a leader, making him a symbolic target. In prison, symbolism is often as important as motive. Salam himself seemed unaware of the impending danger. He moved through his daily routine unbothered: morning prayer, a workout session, a short conversation with a friend on the tier. He had been in federal custody long enough to understand the politics of prison life, but nothing about that morning suggested he were preparing for an attack. If anything, he seemed calmer than usual. The moment the door shut, shortly after noon, a small group of white inmates positioned themselves in strategic locations around the tier. One stood near the office window, pretending to argue with another inmate about commissary items. Another lingered by the showers. A third cleaned a table that didn't need cleaning. Their job wasn't to fight. Their job was to watch. When the cell door clicked open officially for routine movement, 2 men slipped inside quickly and without hesitation. One carried a homemade blade, roughly 12 inches long, carved from metal scavenged from a ventilation grate. The other man blocked the doorway just long enough to keep officers from seeing inside. The attack was far silent at first, then explosive. Salam barely had time to stand. Within seconds, he was struck multiple times. Prison-made weapons don't cut cleanly. They rip through fabric, skin, and muscle with brutal force. The attackers moved with chilling precision, aiming for vital areas, minimizing noise, working quickly before help could arrive. A second DC-affiliated inmate rushed toward the cell to help Salam, but he was met with another weapon. He collapsed before crossing the threshold. On the tier, inmates looked away. Some prayed, some smirked, some froze. Violence inside a penitentiary is like a sudden storm. You can sense it, you can witness it, but you cannot interfere. By the time guards realized something was wrong, it was too late. The door was blocked for crucial seconds. When officers forced entry, the scene inside was unmistakable. 2 men lay on the ground, unmoving. 3 others, in nearby cells, had been attacked moments earlier by different individuals responding to the same command. Chaos, then silence. The alarm shrieked through the prison, echoing off concrete walls. Units went into lockdown. Guards sprinted down corridors with pepper spray, shields, and restraints. Doctors rushed in with gurneys and trauma gear, knowing the odds were stacked against survival. Within minutes, the entire facility was sealed. But the silence after the violence was even more chilling. Inside their cells, members of the attack group sat calmly, as if awaiting the next step. Some wiped blood from their clothing. Others folded their hand behind their backs before the orders even came. Their discipline contrasted sharply with the chaos that had erupted moments earlier. When the reports reached regional authorities, the shock was immediate, but the surprise was not. Prison officials had long suspected that tensions were rising across multiple federal institutions. The conflict at Lewisburg was simply the first visible eruption of something much larger. And when investigators traced the origin of the secret message that sparked the killings, everything pointed back to a single source in Colorado, a man many inmates called the Baron. The man pulling the strings. Thousands of miles away, in a supermax facility built to contain the most dangerous offenders in the country, one inmate lived under conditions so restrictive that his only human contact came through narrow food slots and the voices of guards he rarely saw. Yet from that isolation unit, he wielded influence over prisons nationwide. His real name was Barry Mills, but inside the system, his nickname carried the weight of an empire. To some, he was a strategist, to others a tyrant. But to federal investigators, he was something else entirely, a criminal leader whose decision could lead to coordinated violence hundreds of miles away. Mills had been serving long sentences for violent crimes, but by the 1990s he had evolved from a lone offender into a figure of organizational significance. Through coded letters, trusted couriers, and decades of alliances, he sat at the top of a network so feared that whispers of his name traveled through the prison system like a ghost story. According to later court testimony, the invisible ink kite carried his sanction. The attack at Lewisburg was not spontaneous. It was allegedly the first strike in a planned, multi-institution conflict rooted in retaliation, pride, and decades of racial tension. What happened in Lewisburg was just the opening move. The fallout begins. Following the killings, federal task forces moved quickly. A full lockdown was initiated. Interviews, searches, and intelligence sweeps filled the next several weeks. Officers found coded notes hidden in mattresses, letters disguised as harmless legal mail, and messages smuggled from cell to cell through hollowed-out pen tubes. Slowly, the picture became clearer. The Lewisburg attack wasn't an isolated murder. It was part of a broader plan, an inter-prison conflict orchestrated from isolation units where communication was supposed to be impossible. The federal government realized that if they didn't respond immediately, the violence could spread to other high-security institutions. The fear was simple. If one prison followed the order, more might follow. The investigation that unfolded would stretch nearly a decade, involving undercover informants, flipped members, secret recordings, and one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in federal prison history. But before authorities could build their case, another event would push the conflict into an even darker chapter. A moment that showed investigators the Lewisburg attack was only the beginning. The violence at Lewisburg did more than end 2 lives. It cracked open a hidden world the public rarely saw, in a world where messages traveled faster than God could intercept, where alliances formed in silence, and where men in isolation cells held influence equal to mob bosses on the street. In the days following the murders, the Federal Bureau of Prisons scrambled to understand how something so coordinated had unfolded right under their noses. Officers had known tensions existed between different racial groups, but the precision of the Lewisburg attack didn't look like a spontaneous fight. It looked orchestrated, and the deeper investigators dug, the clearer the truth became. The Lewisburg killings were the first confirmed strike of a nationwide prison war in motion, a system shaken. Lewisburg had always been one of the Bureau's toughest institutions, housing violent offenders, high-risk inmates, and long-term prisoners with reputations forged in past riots and assaults. But what happened that August morning rattled even veteran correctional officers. 2 inmates dead, multiple others severely injured, weapons crafted with surgical precision, attackers cooperating with near-military discipline. The warden convened emergency meetings, suspended visitations, and ordered full institutional searches. Entire housing units were stripped to metal frames. Mattresses were cut open, ventilation grates inspected with flashlights. Piles of confiscated weapons shanks, sharpened aluminum, melted plastic spikes, were laid across long tables in the prison gym. But none of that explained the root cause. To understand it, investigators had to examine patterns that stretched far beyond Lewisburg patterns that linked several federal prisons in suspicious, eerily similar incidents. A history written in blood. The conflict between white supremacist prison organizations and the DC-based inmate groups didn't start in Lewisburg. To understand the Lewisburg attack, investigators traced the fuse back to the mid-1990s to incidents in a different penitentiary entirely, USP Marion. Marion, Illinois, was the country's toughest federal prison before Florence, Colorado, was built. It was a place reserved for men considered too dangerous or too influential to be housed anywhere else. Throughout 1996 and early 1997, the prison experienced a series of racial clashes. A black inmate struck a white inmate with a radio, and assault officers believed was staged so the attacker could be placed in protective segregation. 2 weeks later, several black inmates jumped a group of white inmates on the recreation yard. Threats began circulating. Fights erupted in multiple units. Inmates refused to share space across racial lines. To most officers, these incidents looked like another wave of prison violence. But to federal gang investigators, they formed a pattern, one that suggested a brewing war between organized groups with long histories behind bars. Inside Marion, white inmates believed the assaults were intentional provocations. Black inmates believed whites were positioning themselves for retaliation. Miscommunication fueled paranoia. Paranoia fueled action. And in that boiling environment, one man hundreds of miles away saw an opportunity to reclaim power. A command from the Rockies. At the time of the Marion clashes, a notorious inmate named Barry the Baron Mills was locked inside the federal supermax at Florence, Colorado. His reputation was well known across the prison system: intelligent, disciplined, capable of turning conflicts in his favor. Even in total isolation, he maintained a web of influence through trusted couriers, coded messages, and long-standing alliances. Inmates in multiple institutions believed Mills interpreted the Marion assaults as more than isolated incidents. He viewed them as a threat, a challenge, a test of dominance. And Mills was not someone who let a challenge go unanswered. Investigators later uncovered evidence of a critical moment during this period. A communication Mills wrote using a combination of secret codes, substitution ciphers, and invisible ink. The message traveled from Florence to California, then to Lewisburg, passing through a chain of loyal intermediaries. The decoded orders were stark and chilling. War with DC. Not a fight. Not retaliation. A war. The message signaled not only violence but a shift in strategy. Instead of responding to individual incidents, certain white prison factions were expected to take preemptive action across multiple institutions. Lewisburg was simply the first to carry out the order. The weapon makers. After the murders, FBI agents and prison investigators dissected every detail of the Lewisburg weapons. They weren't crude. They weren't rushed. Each blade had been sharpened on concrete floors for weeks. Some were wrapped with cloth for grip. Others were filed to needlepoint precision. One weapon in particular, a 12-inch metal shard, stood out. It had been crafted from stainless steel stolen from a ventilation unit. The edges were meticulously ground. The handle was wrapped with strips of torn bedsheet, braided tight for stability. This was not a spontaneous weapon. This was a tool made by someone who understood anatomy, understood pressure points, understood lethality. Investigators concluded the weapons had been prepared long before the invisible ink message arrived, meaning the planning started earlier than anyone expected. The search for the messenger. The biggest question investigators faced was simple. How did a note written in Colorado incite murders in Pennsylvania? The federal prison system had strict monitoring procedures. Incoming and outgoing mail was screened. Phone calls monitored. Visits recorded. Yet somehow a message describing war had traveled seamlessly through 3 states and 2 security levels without detection. It was not the first time. In prisons, information spreads like water. It finds cracks, flows with pressure, and moves even when no one can see it. Through interviews, informant statements, and intercepted letters, federal agents mapped the kite's journey, from the Supermax cell block in Florence, to a medium security prison in California, to a white inmate being transferred east, to the Lewisburg population unit. Every handoff was intentional. Every courier was trusted. Every word was coded. The most startling discovery was how subtle the message appeared. The visible writing looked like mundane family updates. Tell my cousin I'm doing well. I heard the weather's cold there. I'm praying for my mother. But between those lines, written with dried urine that only revealed itself under heat, lay the true message. Inmates knew how to fool the system because they had learned the system better than the system learned them. The tipping point. As investigators pieced together the Lewisburg attack, something disturbing became clear. The murders weren't punishment for a single insult. They weren't retaliation for one fight. They weren't personal. They were symbolic. The target chosen at Lewisburg Abdul Salam was well known within the DC-affiliated inmate community. Authorities never confirmed whether he was formally a leader, but his reputation, influence, and connections made him a high-value target. Killing him sent a message. We can reach anyone. The violence that followed was swift, brutal, and designed for impact. 2 men killed, 3 more severely injured, multiple units locked down. Within hours, rumors spread across federal prisons everywhere. Something just went down in Lewisburg. It's starting. There's a new war. Intelligence officers monitoring phone calls and mail began hearing the same coded phrases of facilities in Texas, Illinois, California, and Oklahoma. The fear was real. If one attack succeeded, others could follow. The turning point, a man starts to break. The federal government's investigation gained unexpected momentum when one of the alleged attackers, an older, battle-hardened white inmate with decades in the system, began showing signs of remorse. Hours after the Lewisburg murders, he sat alone in his cell, rocking slowly, staring at the wall. Guards watching him said he looked troubled, almost haunted. By the next morning, he asked to speak with federal authorities. What he said changed everything. He didn't confess outright, but he hinted at deeper motives, broader orders, and a larger network behind the attack. He suggested the Lewisburg killings weren't an accident. They were part of a command that came from high-level leaders in the prison system. He hinted at names. He hinted at codes. He hinted at messages written in a way only certain men would understand. It was the first crack in a fortress of silence. Federal investigators seized the opportunity. Over the next months, they worked to flip more men, offering sentence reductions, protective transfers, and sealed identities. Slowly, story by story, they built a picture of a coordinated structure, one that linked prison yards across the country through coded messages and iron loyalty. The Lewisburg murders were just a visible surface of a much larger iceberg. The government prepares for war. By early 1998, the federal government realized it was dealing with one of the most dangerous internal threats the Bureau of Prisons had ever faced. The response was massive. Dozens of inmates were transferred to higher security facilities. A nationwide intelligence sharing task force was formed. Federal prosecutors began drafting one of the largest organized crime indictments in prison history. Undercover informants were quietly moved into key facilities. Prison mail systems were upgraded, scanned, and restructured. Investigators reviewed 20 years of inmate movement logs to trace alliances. The Justice Department wanted not just the men who carried out the Lewisburg murders, but the men who ordered them. The man at the top of that list was the same name officers had whispered for years: Barry the Baron Mills. If the government could link Mills and his associates to the invisible link kite, they could charge them under federal racketeering laws, the same laws used to dismantle mafia families. But they needed something more, something that could prove Mills sanctioned violence from inside a Supermax cell. They needed documents, letters, recordings, witnesses, anything tying him to the message that declared war. And then, in a stunning twist, they got exactly what they hoped for. Because one man, terrified of what awaited him inside federal prisons if he stayed loyal, decided to betray the group he had served for decades. He would become the government's star witness in a case that would shake the prison system to its core. Detective Marlon Hayes stood in the quiet doorway of the briefing room long after the rest of the team had left. The case had consumed every hour of his week 3 victims, identical scenes, and a city growing more terrified with each passing night. Whoever were behind the crimes had moved like a shadow. No fingerprints, no DNA, no camera sightings. But everything changed only hours ago. A neighbor, sleepless during a sudden power outage, caught something no one else had seen. A figure leaving the victim's home, moving fast, holding something wrapped in a dark cloth, and limping. It was the smallest detail, barely noticeable, but to Hayes, it was the first real crack in the killer's armor. A pattern that perfect only breaks once. Hayes pulled surveillance records, medical reports, and prior complaints cross-referencing until names blurred into numbers. But then, one profile separated itself from the rest. A man with a history of disturbing behavior, trespassing, following neighbors, showing up at random homes late at night. Small incidents, but the kind that revealed a dangerous pattern beneath the surface. And 3 weeks earlier, he had been treated for severe ankle injury. The limp matched, the location matched, the timeline matched. Hayes and his partner moved without delay. By evening, their unmarked car was parked across from the suspect's house. No sirens, no confrontation. This wasn't the kind of case you solved by storming in. They needed confirmation. They needed precision. As the sun sank low behind the rooftops, the suspect stepped out onto his porch. Same build, same height, same quiet drag of the right leg. But what Hayes noticed next ended everything. The suspect carried a backpack the same type described by the neighbor, and inside its open side pocket, tucked carelessly between worn items, was a piece of fabric matching the cloth found in the earlier scenes. Not enough for a charge, but more than enough for a warrant. By midnight, the house was surrounded. The search uncovered what the investigation had been missing. Trophies the suspect had kept, hidden carefully but not carefully enough. Items belonging to each victim. Pieces of the puzzle he thought no one could solve. And there, for the first time since the case began, the city breathed again. Hayes watched quietly as officers escorted the suspect into the squad car, the streetlights reflecting off the vehicle's windows. The case that began with nothing ended with everything. Not because the killer slipped, but because the smallest detail, the limp finally spoke loud enough.